بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody, and welcome back to the LMA podcast. It's our first of the year. We've been running these podcasts for a little while now, alhamdulillah, and this is our first one back since our little hiatus from last year. And of course, our first one back comes, with a major story, some, very serious sort of an important topic to discuss. Alhamdulillah, today we have. Actually, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Bilal Abdul Wahid. I'll be your host today, and I am joined with the Secretary of the LMA, Haj Gamel Kheir. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salam. Thank you for having us back.
And our esteemed lawyer, Majed Kheir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Okay. And of course, today, since our hiatus, the horrific attacks in Bondi took place, an attack that, is condemnable in every sense of the word. Of course, as Muslims, as principled people, we don't condone events like this, the same way that we do not condone and we condemn in the harshest of terms, the killings and bombings that happen on the beaches of Gaza. We should not see this sort of violence happening on the beaches of Bondi. So just to kick things off, we want to get straight into the topic today. I want to just do a bit of a reflection before we jump into the deeper topics and what's transpired since those horrific attacks almost a month ago. Haj, if I can get you to just sort of reflect on, I suppose, what happened, where were you at the time? This is one of those events where you sort of don't forget where you were at and how you were feeling, what ran through your mind.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I was actually in Turkey when it happened. And subhanAllah, Turkey, a Muslim country, it immediately made the news. And then all of a sudden, whenever you mentioned where you're from, Australia, then all of a sudden, that was immediately brought up. But, alhamdulillah, I wasn't here because I thought the same thing everybody goes through every single time one of these incidents happen. Oh, no, please don't be a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so well indoctrinated in us now that we have this constant fear that we live in, that every time something happens, like we're living in this this little cocoon, we're always scared that, oh God, it's another Muslim again. But look, you said to reflect, and let's start by putting a huge caveat out there that this is a heinous act. Cannot be condoned under any form, anything. Nothing can condone what was done. But I don't want to hear this idea of dragging the religion into this concept, because the religion has nothing to do with it. I mean, anyone that studies the basics of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's rules of warfare, automatically, what happened in Bondi has nothing to do with the religion. And that's what I reflected on, because I saw beautiful people. I went to Egypt and I went to Turkey, and I saw beautiful people living in harmony, and this idea never occurs to them. This concept of living in constant fear, and I think we as a Muslim community have suffered from the Cronulla riots till now, that everything that happens, somehow we're collectively to blame. Collectively, we wear the guilt. Collectively, we have to wear the disownment of that person or that individual. And that's what I reflected on, that, when you're living in a majority Muslim country, you don't have that constant, thought process of, oh no, I have to sort of, hatch down the house, and God help us, we're going to be under raid again.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah, that was my first thought process. And then honestly, I remember I was in the mosque and I was saying, Ya Rabbi, please don't be a Muslim. Because I thought when the body count, that was going up, and I thought, oh God, this is going to be terrible.
Jazakallah khair. And just a reminder to the viewers today, feel free to join the conversation. You can keep a comment on Facebook. If we have the time, inshallah, we'll get to it and we'll ask our esteemed guests. We already have one here about the new bill and the government's laws and whatnot. We're going to get to that, inshallah. But do feel free to join the conversation, make your own commentary, and we'll try to mention what we can online, inshallah. Majed, tell us, what were your immediate sort of reactions, thoughts, and feelings?
Yeah, I think, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think exactly like Haj Ahmed said, it was watching it unfold live. And I was actually in the car with a friend. And immediately we said to each other, exactly as Haj Jamel elicited, it was just hopefully it's not, it's not one of ours, so to speak. And you know what, that's, I think seeing the actions that took place on that day, whatever the media and politicians and those two individuals themselves may claim, they're not one of ours. But it was horrifying, and I think it's quite sad because the first thoughts after that are exactly like every other Australian. Is you're watching Bondi Beach. Like I've been there so many times. Like I've walked across that footbridge after looking for parking for 2 hours and spent a day at the beach, and so the same reaction that every other Australian was describing is our reaction. We always have this alien attitude that we're looking at it through some sort of different lens. For those of us, especially those of us that were born and raised in this country, just like every other Australian, you see Bondi is like a real part. And when you travel overseas, first thing people ask about, Opera House, Harbour Bridge, and Bondi Beach. And so it's something that we all, like, even if we don't frequent there, something that you feel a sense of like pride and ownership of as an Aussie. And so you get horrified to see what's taking place. But unfortunately, where every other Australian can just sort of watch on in horror and sadness, we watch on in horror and sadness, and then also in fear, because immediately as you start, the news starts to break is who these people were and who they claimed to be. You just start thinking about your wives, your mums, your sisters, and within hours we were at that point. Unfortunately, it didn't take long. So I think that was sort of that initial reaction was, please don't be a Muslim. Then it was just shock, horror. I can't believe this is Bondi. Is this sort of like what happened with the Link Cafe situation, and you're just watching it unfold, and then you just start thinking about the ladies.
So why do you think that is the collective immediate action response from the Muslim community? What is it that's I guess so deeply entrenched in our DNA at this point? And I have some thoughts on this. I might share them after I get your answers. That what's so deeply entrenched in our DNA that our first reaction is, please don't be us.
I think I actually think it's probably a better way to frame the question is it's not really something that's entrenched within us. It's something that's entrenched within wider society that's caused that fear to constantly live within us. And that's because, like, this attack's not unprecedented. There's been horrific things that have happened in Australia and around the world, numerous, many times over the last few decades in particular. And we've learnt by trial by fire and the worst possible experiences that, unfortunately, no matter what we say, no matter what our ulama say, no matter what our mashayikh and our organizations say, we're going to be held collectively responsible. Our ladies are going to experience a degree of violence and abuse. Our institutions are going to come under extra scrutiny from security organizations. No matter how much we try and change the narrative, we're a few decades on and it's still the place. So I don't think it's something inherent within our community. It's something that we've been forced to adapt to because of things entrenched within media, politics, and wider society, unfortunately.
Haj, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, see, my viewpoint is very similar, but I wanted to expand on something, and it sort of touches on the same topic. The problem that I think I love when government talks about social cohesion. It seems to be the catch cry, but no one seems to be able to define it well. To me, the only time a collective punishment is given is when it happens to be a Muslim individual, so-called Muslim. I mean, I don't even define them as Muslim. I mean, by the very act that they did, they fell outside the fold of Islam. And that's not my ruling. That's Rabb al-Alameen's ruling. You know, if you're going to talk about, do they follow the principles of warfare? No, clearly they didn't. But that's a separate topic. My point really I'm trying to get at is when Martin Bryant did that atrocious act in Tasmania, did all of Australia feel this collective punishment and say, look, he's all to blame? All of you are to blame because of this one individual. No, they quickly individualized him. He was a lone wolf. Love that word. And there was no collective punishment. yes, we collectively decided as a nation that we're going to address gun laws, which was a brilliant thing.
Yeah.
But no one had to wear that guilt except the individual that perpetrated that act.
I think very much, sorry to cut in here, but you reminded me also of almost a year ago when there was the stabbings in one of the shopping centres,
Bondi Junction,
the Bondi Junction shopping
Well,
centre.
and in
the-
Melbourne, the Greek individual that went trying to drive through the shopping centre,
Yeah.
there was no collective punishment handed out. And I'm talking about the media, and I'm talking about Australian public in general. We all need to have a good look at ourselves as how we frame these incidents. You know, I love when we talk again about social cohesion, yet we have this desire to sort of punish a certain community collectively. And then we wonder why, and I'm not condoning, please, this is, I'm putting that out there now, I'm not condoning the act, but then they wonder why these individuals do what they do, because this idea of collective punishment alienates. It actually perpetrates that idea. It infests in that idea that you will never be considered Australian. And we have to learn to educate the wider community that there's no such thing as collective punishment. You know, you can't collectively punish a whole society for the individuals of a person.
Yes. So some of my thoughts on this is that, and it should be mentioned off the top of this episode, that the views that we express are primarily our own as individuals, not those of any particular organization or the Muslim community as a homogenous monolithic group. The Muslim community, like any other community, is diverse, it's rich, there's multiple different types of people and viewpoints and thoughts and thinking, sometimes to our detriment, sometimes to our betterment, alhamdulillah. So my thoughts on this is that, you know, there's this sense of, okay, so now we're gonna go back to the dog whistle politics of old, or we're gonna go back to Islam and Muslims is sort of being surveillanced, right? What's gonna happen to us next, right? Because of the actions of a single individual or a couple of individuals, right? Individuals who the vast majority, in fact, all of us across the spectrum, do not agree with, right? We're going to, we're going to start to see the word Islam and Islamic. And I won't mention particular individual, but someone was quite animated on in the media quite recently, making sure that the word is, Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremism needs to be out there. It needs to be put in legislation. It needs to be legislated into law itself. And this just creates an environment. It starts to create that powder keg environment for something like another Christchurch to happen. If anybody in this community understood the impact of what had happened in Bondi, it is the Muslim community first and foremost, quite sincerely. We all remember what happened where we were. We all remember our reactions. We all remember watching the live streamed footage of Christchurch. I don't know about others, but I sat there and just wept for it was probably the first time. It was very early on in my marriage. It's probably the first time my wife had ever seen me sit there and just cry. So we understand the pain of the situation, but we also then understand that once we start talking about Islamic extremism, Islamic, the term itself will just take on a new life in society and start to create this environment where sisters get bashed in the middle of Parramatta. People are getting spat on, mosques are getting vandalized, pigs' heads are being thrown on, thrown in Islam cemeteries and other sort of religious locations. So we understand this pain more than anybody else, I would say, and we understand the implications of what this means, and that will bring us to another point of the conversation.
Just before you go there, Bill, I mean, let's talk about Christchurch for a minute. When Christchurch happened, right? I didn't see the media going out to every church and saying, "Look, do you disown it? Do you condone it? Do you disavow from it?"
Well, yeah, it was just a lone man.
I didn't see every single white person in Australia having to shove a camera in his face and say, "Do you condone it? Are you against it? Are you going to denounce it?" This collective punishment, and with all due respect, I don't think any other community with all respect to all the other communities, have had to deal with this collective punishment other than the Muslim community in Australia. It's selectively done only to the Muslim community. It's the only time when collectively, all the media outlets and all the Murdoch press have their field day, and all the politicians somehow all agree all of a sudden, they're all on the same page when it's collective punishment to the Muslim community. Somehow we have to disavow from them. Now, that sort of rhetoric and that sort of logic is exactly what they like to call the Muslim extremists prey on. This is exactly their logic. You're feeding into that narrative. It's crazy. We have to change the narrative. We don't punish a whole community for the actions of an individual. The individual gets punished.
So, Haj, do we then, just to sort of follow on to my next question, do we then need to identify these individuals, police ourselves and I suppose, be overly sort of sensitive of our own community to make sure that things like this don't happen? Is it
No, I don't believe it's the collective. It's a collective call for the Muslim community to police itself. I don't think there are. Again, I'm not playing this. And please, don't misunderstand me. I don't want to play the victim mentality. I hate that, because we're not the victim mentality. We have the greatest deen, alhamdulillah. So we're not victims. But the point is, I don't think there is another community that is so much screened and watched and viewed and has a microscope on it than the Muslim community. What more do they want? What am I supposed to watch the next person next to me watch when he's praying and say, "What do you think about this?" By the way, that's not our job. With all due respect to everyone, that's not my job. Our job is to educate people in terms of what the deen requires. My job is not to police. There's police for that. But the point that, again, it goes to collective punishment. The mosques are now told you have to start watching your parishioners. No, I don't. I have to start teaching them about the religion, but it's not my job to go watch. And no, this is by framing the question the way it is, it sort of works into the narrative that they want, that we aren't doing enough. We're not Australian enough. I'm sick of that. I'm truly sick of it. I don't expect the Christian community to go and monitor every single person, the far right wingers and like the Christchurch person. I don't expect the church to do that either. Why is the expectation on the Muslim community to monitor itself?
There's a couple of issues with that from a law enforcement perspective as well. Like that mentality that, why aren't the Muslim communities taking a look at this stuff, and why aren't they reporting these people?
Yeah.
I think that the two biggest problems I have with that talking point, the first is that, like Haj Ahmed said, why should the law enforcement agencies in this country, who are extremely well funded, who are extremely well armed enough to pull over, crash into
enough funding?
Yeah, well, I mean, after this, I doubt they'll have any complaints. But they're well armed enough to smash into a car in Liverpool filled with young, seemingly innocent boys, beat the crap out of them, apologies for the proverbial, and then send them back on the streets as if nothing happened. Why should they, as well-resourced, well-funded organizations who are tasked and paid very handsomely to do this job of policing, security and intelligence, why should they outsource their job to us? Why would that be our job? And I think the second and the bigger issue I have with that talking point is that it lends itself to the suggestion that somehow we know. That somehow there's like a giant WhatsApp group with 2 billion Muslims,
and we're staying quiet on it.
Yeah, and every day we talk as 2 billion Muslims on this WhatsApp group, and once every few months someone messages on the WhatsApp group and says, "Hey, tomorrow I'm going to Bondi and I'm going to do this." We don't know, and in fact that's supported by decades of expert research on terrorist attacks, extremist groups, the people who are actually putting these ideas into the minds of young people, that those individuals and the groups that they claim they represent, they're at the fringes of our community. Nobody that goes to a Friday khutbah in Sydney or in Australia can claim that they've heard this sort of rubbish being spouted on the minbar. For I'd say 99.9% of the manabir who are giving these Friday khutbah every single Friday since the 1960s, there's nobody from the Muslim community and from beyond the Muslim community, because we know they attend our Friday khutbah sometimes, that can say honestly they've heard our mashayikh and our imma and our ulama instructing people to do these things. So that's really what
Okay,
the front I have with that suggestion.
But can't they say just to pose a bit of a challenge here, and we will get into some of the discussion about hate speech a bit later. But can't they say that, look, there's been fiery khutbas, there's been, some that are, quite directly talking about certain communities and people, and therefore that you don't know, to take certain individuals, words, you don't know what power you're going to unleash through your words. So shouldn't we be monitoring and censoring the way that we speak on our manabir? And
Bill, can I let me add to what Majed said, because there's another point that has to be mentioned. The assumption is that we don't assist police. I want to get a federal police agent here and say, Muslim community does not help us at all. But it's a different thing when you're being lectured by the police as to being treated as an equal.
You're working collaboratively.
See, the problem that we have is systemic. And look, we said we're not going to sugarcoat this conversation. We're going to be very frank about it. The problem that we have here is, again, it's collective punishment by authority. Go ask Anik how they got lectured by the police when they went there. The point is, treat us as equals, and I will guarantee you most of the inside information is provided by the Muslim community. But it's different when we provide that information and we're told to go away. It's different when a 13-year-old child is being groomed by the federal police, and hey, what do you expect? I'm not condoning, but the point is, when the authorities try to treat us as collectively guilty, and we're not doing enough, I know what enough means, that's half the problem. The other problem is, who monitors who? Who are you to monitor what I say? If I don't break the law and I say, something that the Quran states, are you going to dob me into the federal police? Who's the monitor? And what rights does the Muslim community have to infringe on someone else's rights to say, hey, I don't like what you said? Now, unless he's saying, I'm going to go commit an act, then we're living in a police state. Is that what we want? Because that's where we're heading. We're heading to a police state. God forbid, we don't want to be Nazis, where everybody monitors everybody and they don't like what they say and they report them to the authorities. Is that what we want? I don't want that.
So on that point, do you have anything to
Yeah,
add to
I
that?
think there was an important point that Haj Jamal made where he was discussing how the irony of the government's approach, the media's approach, society's approach is that the very thing that they're complaining about and trying to address in bullying, isolating, surveilling and demonizing the Muslim community, the very thing that they're trying to achieve, which is to stop terrorism, their approach is in fact lending itself to it. There's actually a very interesting fatwa published by Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri. I think it was from 2014 or 2015 at the height of ISIS's reign in Iraq. And something that he said struck me. It was a 600-page fatwa where he absolutely dismantled the entire religious ideology that was claiming to prop itself up in support of the ideology. But he said that the imperialist actions of Western countries who claim that they hate these attacks from occurring, I think his exact words were, they lend themselves or they add a punch to the war cry of militant recruiters. They add a punch to the war cry of militant recruiters. They actually give these people who are getting into the minds of young, isolated and confused Muslim men who are the primary targets, they give them the ammunition to say, hey, look, this society doesn't accept you. And when you're a confused 13, 14, whatever-year-old young man already has the struggles of teenagehood, and someone tells you constantly that you don't belong, and on the other side of the door, there's someone or something with its arms wide open, embracing you and telling you, come here, I'll give you a safe space. I'll tell you what you really need to do. And it just so happens that what you really need to do is go back and harm those people who sent you out into the world alone and afraid in the first place. So I think there's a real cruel irony in the approach that's being taken right now, is that in an effort to curtail these things from happening again, we're actually just arming these psychotic individuals with the information and the circumstances that they need. They'll be watching the bill that got announced 2 days ago. They'll be watching the Liberal Party's commentary. They'll be watching the media commentary, particularly right wing, the likes of Pauline Hanson clapping. And this is exactly what we need. Send more young Muslim men out into the street, confused, afraid, angry, with a vendetta at the society the society that disowned them. So I think somehow after 4 or 5 decades, we really haven't learnt our lesson.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we that's a very, very pertinent point when you start thinking about it. How the environment, that sort of Islamophobic environment, then lends itself to these more some of these ideas that people would love to exploit. So just to move on to the sort of next part of the conversation, I want us to just have a look at the way that the narrative moved and shifted very quickly after what had happened. Again, what had happened was an absolute atrocity, and oftentimes after these atrocities, people try to come together. I feel like, and this isn't just me, this is, the commentary of many other, wider society, the likes of Anthony Lowenstein and others, feels like we were divided as a nation almost after this. There was, in many ways, the politics had taken over very quickly.
Yeah.
Certain pushes and calls were put to the forefront of the conversation before before some of the bodies had the respect of being buried even. Did you feel the same?
I beg to differ. I want to be even more. I think the majority of Australians can now see through the Murdoch agenda. I think the majority of Australians know that they're being fluffed. And that's not condoning what these heinous acts. I mean, they deserve the full extent of the punishment, this individual. But how quickly it was politicized, how quickly an agenda was driven, how quickly we were all the facilities that were available to the Murdoch press and the far right, how quick they got onto these machinations of we need to start passing the most atrocious breach of civil liberties. And the hope was that while everyone is mourning the 15 dead and are in shock, because we are in shock, and I'm in shock till now that I can't believe I lived Cronulla riots, I lived Christchurch, and now I'm living Bondi. And, they stick in my head more than, with all due respect, what's happening in the Middle East. They stick in my head because, like Majed said, I've been here. I've been to all these places, and they ring a bell with me. But how quick the agenda was driven to start passing laws, legislations, limitations on civil liberties. And, the funny thing I find I have a lot of faith in Australia. I really do. I think Australians are wised up because the last election, the Murdoch media was going hell for leather trying to get Albanese and the ALP out, and they didn't. And I have faith in the Australian community that they can see through this. Because what's happening right now is a drive to limit all the civil liberties that, this country prides itself on. And it's been driven by an agenda. And sadly, the 15 lives that were lost have been politicized to drive that agenda. That's my opinion. I mean, this is no one else's opinion but my opinion. And the irony to me is the Murdoch press that keeps on screaming every time, freedom of speech, freedom of media to say what they want. It's only when it suits their narrative. The minute the Muslim community has an ulterior motive or ulterior position, and I'm talking about all the other, the vast blanket of what constitutes Muslim organizations, whether I'm support them or not, they have a right to free speech. If the Murdoch media believes in free speech, so they should honor the fact that they are also entitled to free speech. You may not like what they say, but they're entitled to say it. Now, there's a drive here. And the deaths have been so politicized and so armed up to get what the right wing wants. And that's my view on it. It's an agenda by the right wing to get through everything that they want, so everyone can see the world through their eyes only. And if you don't see the world through their eyes, then you're an alien.
Majed.
Yeah, I think Haj Gamel mentioned Port Arthur earlier in this discussion, and I found myself I wasn't alive at the time that took place, but I found myself sort of reading a little bit about the political fallout of that. And actually, there was a documentary released recently about the political fallout and the gun reform that occurred. And John Howard was Prime Minister at the time, I believe, and he actually gave an interview a few months ago talking about his prime ministership at the time and what a challenging time that was for Australia. And having had the benefit of researching that just a few weeks before this occurred, I think John Howard probably, I preface my comments by saying that John Howard probably did more to damage and destroy social cohesion in this country than the next 50 MPs combined. But I will say that following Port Arthur, what John Howard quite rightly said was the houses came together, the parties came together and said, this is beyond gutter games, political point scoring. We're not going to turn the innocent lives lost into a political weapon. And they came together and they came out with probably the greatest law reform we've had in this country ever.
Mm-hmm.
And it was seen as ridiculous and crazy at the time globally because it stood out. Until now, these are the strongest gun laws in the world and they're being strengthened even further. But every other country that laughed at us looks at our record of deaths by firearm as opposed to the rest of the world, and we're right down the bottom. And it turned out to be a brilliant move. Why? Because they didn't weaponize it. They didn't turn it into an opportunity for political point scoring. They got together and did what needed to be done for the safety and greater good of the country. Contrast that to within days, the leader of the opposition placing blame squarely at the feet of the Prime Minister, whose hands are not free of blood by any stretch of the imagination. Politicians make mistakes. It's the nature of public office. But saying that he was to blame for fostering an environment of anti-Semitism, which caused, and then following on from that, Josh Frydenberg, a failed treasurer, failed potential prime minister, failed potential leader of the opposition, all of a sudden springs back into action and places blame on the feet of Anthony Albanese, and then in tandem, the leader of the Zionist genocidal state of Israel, also placing the blame at the feet of the prime minister. That was political point scoring. That was political opportunism. Pauline Hanson took an opportunity to go and pay her respects by putting her makeup on, taking a camera crew, and turning a memorial, a community memorial, just hours after more than a dozen people had been gunned down, quite brutally, to make videos for her campaign. That's political point scoring, and that's what causes the division that leads to things like Bondi. That's what causes the division that leads to distrust amongst the various communities within Australia. So that's really, I mean, Port Arthur is a great example for us to look back on and see the value of how those politicians handled it versus how our so-called politicians have dealt with it.
But even more recent, Christchurch.
Yeah.
Look at the way Christchurch was handled, and look at the way this Bondi incident was handled, and just see the vast difference in the way they were treated. Christchurch was treated as a catastrophe, and it was a blight on all of humanity. And there wasn't this idea of political point scoring. It was, how do we avoid this ever happening again in New Zealand? And hats off to them, because it was one of the worst incidents they've ever experienced. But they didn't take a chance to start throwing all these agendas and all this politicizing and weaponizing everyone and alienating communities. The way they handled it, and even the way they handled the tribute, the memorial after, was absolutely incredible. Now, that is a show of how you bring communities together. Compare it to Bondi. It's like, what I was going to say what pisses me off, but I can't say what I'll tell you anyway. What annoys me, there you go, I said it properly. What annoys me is the assumption is that the Muslim community somehow isn't grieving over what happened in Bondi. It's like, we're all sitting there celebrating what happened, God forbid. We're in trauma. Because one, we all know Bondi, as Majed said. Two, what's the stop? The next crazy person with a gun going to Lakemba Mosque and start firing away. That is a reality now that we all live with. So we're all going through this same trauma. But on top of that trauma, we have to somehow bear guilt.
Yep.
So on top of the trauma, we have to have guilt. Why? Why can't that same sympathy that's being felt for all the rest of the Australians go to the Muslim community as well? On top of that, all of a sudden now we want to agenda drive it and say, oh, we don't want to have freedom of speech at all. We want to curtail what you guys say and what you do and how you practice and what you can say, what you can't say. You can't even,
what religious texts you can be
where
quoting.
you can meet, whether you can meet at all, who can you, even to the extent where even phrases that somehow may
I mean, the conversation's almost moved into how do we create a second-class citizen in this country?
well, scarier than that, the conversation has now gone to really a police state.
Yeah,
We
that-
want to say, we want to know, we want to dictate to you
Mhm.
what you can and can't say.
Yeah.
You know, if I believe in an intifada,
Mhm.
I can't say that anymore because why? Why? Who am I offending? Who am I offending if I'm supporting a downtrodden people? I don't
Mhm.
understand.
Well,
But we're getting
which is
to
a
that
phrase,
stage.
which is a phrase that's been completely misunderstood.
It is that. I
Not,
don't
not-
think it is. It's been weaponized.
it's been weaponized.
They've
weaponized, yeah.
weaponized.
It's
They're
intentional.
trying to weaponize everything that speaks to the genocide that's happening in Israel. That's look again. These are my opinions, please. This is
Yeah,
not
of
the
course.
LMAs. But that intifada word, the media was talking about it for the last 20 years. It's been happening.
Mhm.
But now this unfortunate incident happens. We've weaponized and politicized the whole Gaza issue.
Mhm.
And that's the alarming thing to me. That, do I trust politicians to pass laws and to govern? No, I don't. This is why I have my faith in the court process and the judicial process. They're at arm's length. They'll make the legislation. They'll ensure that there's no laws being broken. I don't want politicians who are driven by political advantage to somehow pass laws that I can and can't say. And that's what's been driven by this thing.
Okay, and so let's move the conversation into that. But just before I do that, brothers and sisters, viewers of all persuasions who are online, I believe we've got almost 30, 40 people sort of watching concurrently. Feel free to join the chat, leave a comment, leave a question. If we have the time, I'll get to it. We've got two brilliant guests who will be able to answer those succinctly, I'm sure. On top of that, please follow the LMA's page, the Lebanese Muslim Association's page, the LMA Mosque page, and follow us on Facebook, on YouTube as well, under the Lebanese Muslim Association.
I think I wanted to touch
yeah.
on that commentary by Haj Jamal. You asked whether that word, or you mentioned whether that word intifada had been misunderstood, and like Haj Jamal quite rightly pointed out, misunderstood is a very innocent way of framing it. It's actually it's been intentionally weaponized, and I think the most important point when we discuss the framing is that in the hours, days, and weeks that followed that tragic attack, we saw probably the worst case of outright gaslighting of the wider Australian community when it comes to the pro-Palestinian movement or the anti-genocide movement, because immediately senior members of state and federal government, members of the media were talking about the Harbour Bridge protests, we're talking about Hyde Park protests. I think anyone, particularly within the Muslim community, who has even the faintest familiarity with the ideology of the people who do the sorts of things that those two individuals did at Bondi, would laugh at that suggestion that they were somehow motivated or inspired by Harbour Bridge, because anyone who knows these people knows they probably hate the Muslims who went on that bridge just as much as they hate the people that they were taking. Exactly, because such is the extremity of their views. They're completely incompatible with a movement that, in Australia at least, is largely defined by members of the left wing, socialists, people with
All forms
a very
Majed,
diverse
how do you
identity.
how do you think that rhetoric that came out, especially like the veracity in which talking about the Harbour Bridge was used, the veracity of talking about the protests about certain phrases, globalize the Intifada. I could still say it, it's still legal at this point. How do you think that has been used to then go back and draft, and we want to get into it now, draft the sort of legislation that we've seen over the last few days come out?
Yeah. Well, it was just the most blatant, outright lying, but it served its purpose, because its purpose was to something that's and I said that what happened at Bondi wasn't unprecedented. Something that was unprecedented was this: the Muslim community is used to and familiar with the feeling of being held collectively responsible for these terrible, tragic events. What occurred here was an even more egregious lie. It extended beyond the Muslim community.
Yeah.
It extended to 350,000 Sydney-siders who said kids should not be starved in camps. Children should not be forced into tents for safety and then bombed in those tents. So it was actually beyond the Muslim community. It went out to anyone who dared believe that it was wrong to kill 75,000, on a very conservative estimate, Palestinians in Gaza. And you know what? The sad reality is that a lot of those people who are not members of the Muslim community probably feel how we feel now. Like people who've been going to protest every single Sunday since October 2023 because they don't think that innocent people should be killed. And so how was it used? By creating that fear, by creating that dishonest, baseless narrative which had absolutely no evidentiary basis whatsoever, couldn't possibly have had an evidentiary basis because by the time the narrative was being perpetrated by politics and the media, the law was already being drafted. The law enforcement hadn't had an opportunity to even determine what the political or ideological motivations of the perpetrators were. But all of a sudden, people appointed themselves as experts and arbiters of the truth, and in doing so drafted both at a state and federal level legislation that's, I mean, there's no other word to describe it except that it's oppressive. It's oppressive. And they utilized that weapon. And had they not implicated the entire pro-Palestinian movement, millions of Australians, billions of people around the world, in every country, including the Western world, had they not cast a shadow and a doubt over the actions and the morality of all of those people, they wouldn't have been able to do this. But they successfully employed that narrative, sent it out, and with the fear that it created and the doubt that it created, they were able to. I mean, look, the latest bill hasn't passed yet, but if the news is to be believed, it's inevitable, and I hope that that's not the case. But it did serve that purpose. It served that purpose of generating enough fear. And look, the Muslim community wasn't enough of a target.
Yes,
I don't think that
the entire.
it had to implicate the entire pro-Palestinian movement. And like I said, it's just really laughable to those of us who are familiar with the ideology of terrorists, people inspired by ISIS, is that they hate us even more than they hate the people they carry. And that's the reason why most of the victims of ISIS are Muslims.
So well and truly, this legislation, to put it quite frankly, doesn't. It's not even about them.
Well, yeah, I think
to be honest, it's about suppressing the speech around the pro-Palestinian movement.
Yeah, and curtailing criticisms of Israel, because I think if you look at it logically, we're not quite into the stage of this conversation of talking about specific things within the bill that are concerning. And in fact, I don't think we're going to have enough time over 10 podcasts to talk about how terrifying this legislation is. But let's look at it from a logical perspective. You don't need to be a legal expert to consider this from just a common sense perspective. It was 4 weeks ago yesterday that the attacks occurred. It was, I think, 7 days after the attack that charges were formally laid. And it was about 10 days ago that they received intelligence back about things like these individuals' travels to Philippines and things like that. And they really got to the bottom of their movements in the lead up to the attack. How is it possible, if this bill was genuinely about addressing Bondi and making sure Bondi never happens again, how is it possible that they gathered the intelligence in 4 weeks to develop an omnibus legislation which covers a variety of legal areas that's going to somehow curtail what happened at Bondi? I think one of the members of the far-right media have been very critical of the bill in the sense that there's a defense for religious text. Not that I agree with the criticism, but I think that there's some irony in what they're saying. They're saying, well, if the narrative was these people are somehow, and I don't think that's the case, and I think the research on this issue doesn't reflect that it's the case, but let's say for argument's sake, these individuals are inspired by religious texts that they've misinterpreted and taken out of context. Why would you then include a defense to say that you can teach those religious texts? I'm happy that it's there. I'm not happy about the bill. I'm happy that it's there at the very least.
Well, he answered that.
Yep.
He answered that by saying that, look at the Old Testament. If you want guts and glory and glorification of war,
exactly.
go look at the Old Testament.
Exactly.
But the point is, no one looks at that. There's no one
Well,
arguing
I
that.
mean, it was a verse from it was a term from the Old Testament that was used very early on in the genocide, and we'll call it a genocide here, to, I suppose, to showcase what the people of Gaza meant to the to the powers that be. The word Amalek, a very,
Yeah.
and the phrase itself means these people are not just deserving of death themselves, but entire generations and livestock.
Yes.
And you know,
But look, to sort of stay on the narrative, I wanted to add a couple of things to what Majed said. Number one is, look how quick the definition of what is considered anti-Semitism was drafted. Incredible.
yes,
And what would constitute criticism of a country and its policies committing a genocide to somehow conflate with being against the Jewish faith? But that was drafted. I mean, who? You just think by chance? You don't think the government was being pressured by the right wing, the Murdoch press, the Zionist organizations to enforce that? But why were they so insistent on being enforced? Because they wanted to shut down the pro-Palestinian thing. This was an embarrassment to them that white-haired, blue-eyed Aussies were actually protesting against the genocide. And they thought, this has never happened. The Arabs are easy. We can shut them down. But now all of a sudden we've got all of the Australians of all persuasions of life, of atheists coming out and saying, hey, I don't want atrocity on my hands. That's number one. Number two,
this country needs to stop with delivering F-35 parts. And you know, people came out to protest for, it was called the March for Humanity.
we don't want a
for
genocide
reason.
under my watch. I don't want to participate in a genocide. It's very simple. I mean, most humans would say, I don't want to participate in a genocide or a murder of anyone, let alone 75,000. I think it's way more.
Yeah.
But anyway, number two, the other thing that I find so ironic is these people who are politicizing the unfortunate death of the 15 people have no sympathy for 75,000 that have died. It drives me crazy. You know, where is the opposition leader condemning 75,000 dead? Where's that condemnation? Whether you support or are against Hamas and Palestine and the Arab world or Islam in general, 75,000 by a conservative count have died, yet not a blink of an eye.
And you can't sort of just say, oh, okay, that's a tragedy that's happening overseas. Leave it overseas. No one is saying that, you know, there should be violent action performed here. Of course not. That's the furthest thing anybody's saying. But as human beings, as people of conscience, at the very least, you look at that and you say, the world needs to do something.
Yes. Look, and to the Prime Minister's credit, he did say that what happened in Bondi did not occur in a vacuum. You know, there was geopolitics that occurred, that you cannot deny the fact that the geopolitics of what's happening in Gaza has somehow played into this narrative. You know, and this didn't happen in a vacuum. And then the right wing and the Murdoch press wants to assume that this just happened, just self-combusted by itself. Nothing to see here. A couple of crazy people, nothing else conspired here. Nothing inspired them other than their crazy religion.
Yeah,
that's the narrative. But to his credit, at least he came out and said, you know, I can't solve the issues that's happening in Gaza.
I think there are two things that really betray this legislation and this bill. It's not legislation yet, thankfully. There are two things that really betray just how baseless it is and the lack of evidentiary basis that it's actually going to solve anything. The first is that every single major study conducted since 1980 of every single terrorist attack that's occurred over the last 45 years has come to the same conclusion. Every time they go to that study, it comes back to the same conclusion, that the people who commit these atrocities are motivated by politics, by political ideology. Whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, every single one of them says that they are, or every single piece of research says that it's political and ideological motivations. But somehow the bill has a raft of offences and amendments relating to religious leaders. Again, we said that this happened 4 weeks ago. There's
Majed,
absolutely
just on that. So is it that it's political ideology, or is it that there's political grievance in there as well?
both. So Gallup conducted a poll which is outdated now, but it was a poll that studied 315 terrorist attacks across the world. Went into detail on what were the motivations of those people. Polled the family members of those people, polled individuals from the villages that those people came from and that lived around them. And that poll concluded that there was no connection whatsoever between terrorist attacks and the religious or spiritual beliefs of those people. What every single terrorist attack had in common was a desire for the attackers to send a political message, usually relating to the presence of the population that they targeted within land that those people perceived to be their homeland. Right. So it was political grievance. And that's why earlier in the discussion, we're talking about Western imperialism and military intervention in the Middle East. Every single study of every single terrorist attack has told us the same thing. It hasn't changed. And most of the studies are quite dated that I'm quoting. But even till now, if anything, it would be further evidence of that, because since then we've had Gaza, we've had further interventions in Afghanistan, we've had a proposed intervention in Iran, which may or may not be forthcoming.
Lebanon, Syria.
And so and then you look at this bill, and what this bill spends the first 40 odd pages dealing with is what? Religious leaders, preachers, and religious texts. If the bill was really about what it said it was about, and if the government was honest about what it was doing, and that it's about preventing another Bondi, where's the evidence to suggest that these people had a religious preacher, had religious instruction? If they did have a religious preacher or instruction, who were they? Are they even from Australia? Why is launching an assault, an unbridled attack on the Muslim community, on religious leaders, going to prevent another Bondi? We don't even know who was in these people's ears. There's been allegations, there's been suggestions. I'm sure there was. But how, only 4 weeks on, are we launching this attack on spiritual leaders, particularly within the Muslim community, when there's no evidence to suggest that the people who did this even had religious instruction? We don't know. And so that's what lends itself to the argument that this is not really what they're saying it's about. Their motivation is not preventing another Bondi. Because if it was, there'd be a lot more time taken, and there'd be some evidence to suggest that these steps are going to solve anything. One of the most commonly cited phrases that we've heard is groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir are somehow being held accountable and going to be prescribed under certain lists and all, under this new bill. They're going to be hate organizations. Okay, well, where's the evidence that these people who did this even knew that Hizb ut-Tahrir existed? Did they know they exist? Did they follow them on Facebook? If there is evidence, okay, show it to us. But otherwise, stop pretending that the bill is about stopping another Bondi, because if it was, there'd be some sort of evidentiary basis for it.
But look, secondly, is how do you? It's to me, this legislation is trying to put a Band-Aid on a major wound. You're not going to solve it. I mean,
there's no way of doing that.
But you're not solving the way you're
weeks
doing
of,
it. Not only that, because closing down the prayer halls and monitoring what the mosques say. Do they honestly think that these people that will stop them? All they're doing is driving them underground. You're making the problem actually worse, because now you can't even monitor them at all. You're asking the Muslim community to monitor them. Well, then if you're driving them underground, how do we monitor them now? So you're not addressing the wound. The wound. Look, I've always argued that to solve this problem is going to take a lot of education, and we all have to be educated to respect civil liberties, to respect the country you're in, all these things that we all talk about, but we don't spend time actually educating. It's all lecturing, and it's big brother controlling little brother. And that has to stop. And this legislation just reinforces that we're going to be above you. We're going to watch you. Not only is the cameras, they're not enough anymore, nor the microphones that we've implanted enough anymore. Now we're actually going to stop you. Stop what you say, or full stop. That's it. We're going to control that as well.
Jazakallah khair for that, Sheikh Haj. Look, there's two questions just before we wrap up. So the first one I just want to go through really, really quickly. There's a comment that's been made. Someone raised just something that you had said a little bit earlier in the conversation, saying that these individuals are outside of the fold of Islam. Just to be clear, this isn't a statement of kufr or a question of.
What I meant by that is the acts of those individuals
Mhm.
puts it outside the fold of Islam. I don't judge anybody whether they're in or out the fold. That's Rabbil Alameen's job. What I'm saying is the acts that they perpetrated in the name of Islam could not be in the name of Islam. They were outside the name of Islam because Islam does not condone what that
And we just want
let
to
me
get
just
that
correct
get
that.
that
That was
cleared
my
up.
error. I
Get,
apologize.
yeah, get that corrected for the record. Now, Majed, you said that we could go through 10 podcasts and not even start to scratch the surface of this legislation. However, we do have a legal expert with us,
No, well,
and I'd like to ask, what are the top three, at least, most problematic parts of this legislation?
yeah. Oof, just three.
I mean, I'm happy for you to go
okay.
for the top 10
I
list if
think-
you've got them off his.
I think the most egregious, in my opinion, relates to these the proposition that there's going to be a list of hate organizations. When the bill was first announced, before it was actually published, the draft was published. I sort of suspected. I joked to someone that it was going to be like the prescribed terrorist light. A fat-free version. It's just organizations that are. I think. I can't remember. I think it might have been the commissioner of the AFP that said that. These are organizations that float just out. It's like they sort of flirt with the boundary, and they know what they're doing, and they make sure that they don't sort of cross that line. So that's what I expected it would be. But boy, was I in for a surprise, because what I think is really concerning is all of the commentary has surrounded two particular organizations that are being sort of paraded as the model example of organizations that would be captured by this list. So Hizb ut-Tahrir from the Muslim community and the National Socialist Network,
Yep.
Who are far right extremists who have disbanded anyway.
Yep.
After the announcement of the bill. But when you read the bill and the bar that's required to be crossed for an organization to be deemed a hate organization, you will realize very quickly that Hizb ut-Tahrir might be the flavor of the month right now, but that bar is so terrifyingly low that the second another organization in 6 months, 12 months, or whenever steps out of line, they'll find themselves in the crosshairs. Why do I say that? Because there is no judicial oversight of the decisions that the AFP minister can make in prescribing an organization as a hate organization. Before I go on, a hate organization, if you're a member of a hate organization, you can go to jail for 7 years. If you direct a hate organization, you can go to jail for 15 years. Right? These are the consequences that we're talking about, these lists. If you're deemed a hate organization and you're added to this list, so the consequences are very severe. But why I say the bar is so low is because there is no judicial oversight whatsoever. The minister has specifically put, the draft has specifically put in place multiple clauses saying that there is no requirement for what we call procedural fairness in determining who goes on this list. It's based on intelligence, which is not published, which is not provided to the public, not even to the organizations who are going to suffer the consequences of being prescribed. They don't know what this intelligence is, and additional information. So let me paint a picture of a hypothetical scenario. Let's say Israel continues its genocide in Gaza and more people die. And then a Muslim organization who advocates on behalf of the Muslim community stands up and begins a commentary on the many violations of international law by the Israeli government. If that commentary is deemed too harsh, it is hate speech. Even if it is not subject of a criminal charge, you haven't broken any law. You haven't incited violence. You haven't told someone to commit a terrorist attack. You've just been overly harsh in your criticism of the state of Israel. That's hate speech. Your entire organization can now be branded a hate organization. The reason for that is because the government recently adopted what's called the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
And this has been adopted now.
This has now been adopted
Yes,
by the
in
federal
the-
government.
in the
And that
legislation.
definition, that definition that we're talking about, why is everyone sort of banging their heads against the wall and complaining so much about it? It's because it now includes criticism of the state of Israel,
As
which
anti-Semitism.
is anti-Semitism. Criticism which goes beyond the ordinary criticism of another state's the actions of the government of another state. And so that would be the most terrifying thing. The second thing is that it's retrospective. There's literally 250 years worth of common law and academic commentary about how severe a step that is to take. So for those listeners who aren't really familiar with the term and have seen it thrown around quite a lot, retrospective means that this law, which if it comes into place, doesn't only apply to future conduct. If you did something or said something in the past before this law even existed, it can be held against you as a group. Like, for example, I want to try you take away from this topic to make it quite clear why this is so horrible.
Please do.
Right now, the legal age for consent for intimacy in Australia is 16.
Yes.
Let's say the government woke up tomorrow and said, we're actually going to raise that age. We think that's too young. We're going to make it 21.
Mhm.
A year ago, someone was 18 years old and he had a girlfriend who was also 18 years old and they engaged in some sort of intimacy.
Yeah.
At the time, the law said that they were perfectly entitled to do that.
Yep.
Right? But 2 years later, the government changed its mind and said, no, we actually think it's 21.
They'd be punished now.
They're going to be punished for that, even though it wasn't a criminal offense at the time. So you're effectively being punished for saying words
That
when
were
at the
legal
time that you said those words, the law which outlawed them didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So and you know what the irony is, that one of the most famous common law judgments about retrospective legislation was given by Justice Virginia Bell of the High Court, who has also recently been appointed. Her name will be familiar. Has recently appointed in charge of the Royal Commission for now. Pending further crying from the Zionist lobby. But she actually described the concept of retrospective law as being abhorrent and antithetical to common law justice and procedural fairness. Judges, legal academics, it's been well entrenched in the doctrine of common law countries for over 2 centuries that laws can't be retrospective, because how can you punish people or groups for doing things that are legal at the time?
You're effectively punishing people for thoughts.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I think, those 2 things stand out to me, the way that the groups can be retrospectively punished and how low the bar is for those groups. And then the third thing, from the perspective of the Muslim community, is that the wording of every part of this legislation, when it comes to targeted people and protected people, is extremely, extremely careful and deliberate. So there are now targeted persons, as they described in the legislation, that if you target someone for any one of these reasons, which I'll list in a moment, then that's hate speech or a hate crime. What are the protected characteristics? Nationality, race, or ethnicity.
No religion involved.
Religion's not involved. A host of other disabilities not involved. A host of other minority communities who say that they're the target of hate speech and hate crime are not protected under the legislation. We know that a certain community, which is a religious community, is also deemed to be a race, an ethnic minority.
Yes.
We also know that there are numerous Australian dual citizens who also hold citizenship of Israel, who have participated in what's been described as a plausible genocide, who are returning to Australia. That is their national origin. They are Israeli.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but that characteristic is now a protected characteristic. But as Muslims, when we had an imam 3 days ago who was assaulted in his car with his wife, when we had a Muslim sister a week ago who was targeted and had her hijab pulled off, we had numerous attacks, and the research is very well established on the rise in Islamophobic incidents over the last 2 years.
We're not a race.
But we're not a race. And so that protection doesn't apply to us. And we have things like aggravated sentences. It's an aggravated feature of offending if it's a hate crime. You think back to Sheikh Wissam and the case that unfolded approximately 12, 13 months ago, where he was a target of an attack by an individual who spent months planning the attack and talking about how she hated him because he believed in Allah and because he was religious and because of his political activism. She didn't spend a single day in jail. She's walking free on the streets now. She also targeted the sister who was wearing hijab because she had the Palestinian flag on her shirt. Ideally, it would be a silver lining of this draconian, disgusting bill if, at the very least, we could say, okay, well, if that happens again, God forbid, at least we know it's going to be treated much more harshly. Because I think everyone was disappointed with how Sheikh Wissam's case was handled. I saw it, my personal opinion and my legal opinion was that it was an attempt on his life. She tried to kill him.
Yeah,
And she didn't spend a single day in jail. She drove his car at him as a pedestrian at speed. I don't know what else you're going to achieve by doing that. Except
and it
killing
was
someone.
premeditated. Then it was.
And it was based on the fact that he was a Muslim.
Mhm.
And so you'd say, okay, silver lining, as a Muslim community, we can take a bit of comfort from that. But no, we can't. So, like, I used Sheikh Wissam's case as an example because we would at the very least welcome some change that saw these attacks treated with the same seriousness, with the same seriousness that attacks by so-called Muslim people against the wider community. But we don't even have that. And so look, if I had to summarize it into three things, and I have to because we don't want to upset you, Haj Bilal, and everyone's probably getting a bit tired. Those are the three things that really stand out to me. The retrospective nature of the laws, the fact that they exclude religious identity, and how low the bar is. And I think many people would be looking, if I can speak freely, many people would be looking at Hizb ut-Tahrir right now and thinking, thank God that's not me, that's not my masjid, that's not my sheikh, that's not my organization. But one day
the
it'll change.
bar is so low. I mean, see, this is the unknown. It's uncharted territory.
Just a question. Sorry, just before you jump in, Haj. Just a question on the bar being so low. Is there a definition of what hate speech is in this legislation?
Yes, and it's terrifying. Hate speech is anything which targets a community which is
Those
within one of
categories.
those categories, and which could be perceived by a reasonable member of that community as hate speech or as intimidatory or causes them fear. One step further, and I've been practicing criminal law for almost a decade. This is the first time I've ever read anything like this. Not only is the bar that low, there also does not even need to be evidence that anyone was offended by it.
Yeah.
So there are laws relating to hate speech, fear, intimidation, right? But there has to be somebody who can say, I was intimidated. And not only put your hand up and say you were intimidated or you felt like it was hate speech or you felt fear. You need to show there has to be a reasonable basis for it.
Yeah.
So for example, if I'm chained up against the wall and my hands are chained up and there are 10 people holding me against the wall and I say, Haj Bilal, and I would never say this, but I say, Haj Bilal, I'm going to come punch you in the face. It's not a reasonable fear, is it?
No.
Right? But here, they don't even need to prove that there was fear or that there was intimidation. There's no what we call evidence of injury. There's no victim. There's no one saying that I felt fear, I felt intimidation, I felt like I was hated because of these characteristics. The speech can be determined at an arbitrary, subjective level with no objective overview as hate speech, even with no one saying that they feared it.
Wow.
To add to that,
Yep.
my fear is they passed a hate law, or they're trying to pass a hate law, which no one suffers more than, by any statistics you want to use, by any organization you want to use, the Muslim community suffers from Islamophobia more than any other community. Okay? I'm not coming from a legal perspective. I'm coming from a community perspective.
we've seen it from
No,
the
I'm coming from a
Islamophobic
community
register and
perspective.
the rest of it, yeah.
How much consultation were the Muslim community provided before these hate legislation were drafted? Zero.
You would be in better position.
Zero. Yeah, we suffer the most. Yet somehow the legislation was hate speech to protect Australia. Yet the ones who suffer the most hate, by any statistics you want to use, were completely shut out of any legislation.
The slight pushback would be from externally would be, look, why are you centering yourself as a Muslim community now? When it comes to this legislation and when it comes to these laws, the whole purpose and the whole reason we need these laws is because we needed to protect people. We needed to protect a particular group of people. It was a Muslim that perpetrated the attacks.
But that legislation doesn't cover just that attack. That legislation, by any design, by any government, is supposed to protect all Australians going forward, not in the past. I mean, I can't bring back the 15. I wish I could. But legislation is being passed in order to protect everybody, all Australians. If you remove the faith of nearly 1 million people in Australia and say they got no protections on this legislation because they're not a race, how are you protecting them? How is it a hate legislation? Why are we calling it for what it is?
Indeed.
It's protecting certain people. So what you're doing is, by whether it's default, and I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, I don't think it is, but if it was by default, you are elevating a certain community above other communities. Now, was that intended, or was that going to happen by design? Was it by design or by chance? I don't know. Only government can answer that. But we're talking about social cohesion. Yeah, I love that word. That was the number 4 category on the Royal Commission. How do we promote social cohesion? Hey, I've got an answer for you. Let's try and treat all the Australians equally. You know, we're going to pass hate laws that protects all of Australians. We're going to pass religious protections.
Do it in a way that's consultative and brings in.
Well, let's do
different
it.
parts of the
I've been
community.
crying, and thank God the Greens have jumped on now. The Royal Commission should be looking at all forms of racism, all forms of bigotry, all forms of hatred. Why? Why are we calling it specifically for a certain community? I'm not denying that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It exists. Clearly it exists. So does Islamophobia. So does the original people of this country. They suffer from a lot of hatred and racism. So do a lot of other communities. Why aren't they also being afforded the same comforts and the same protections and the same commission that's going to be inquiring? Why aren't they looking into all forms of hatred? Why?
That's the $1 million question right there, I believe. Look, we do have to start. We do have to wrap up. We've got a few more minutes before Salat al-Isha and the adhan goes off. But I do want to end on one final question, if I may, to Majed here. What can we do as a community? How should we prepare ourselves? And what can we do to sort of push back on this legislation, if anything?
I think in terms of preparation, the most important thing would be, and I've discussed this with Haj Gamel, I've discussed this with a number of organizations, in particular Mashayikh, is the most vulnerable people after this legislation, if it is passed in its current form, are going to be our Mashayikh, our Imams, our Khatibs, people with front-facing, public-facing forward, media facing roles in the public eye that are going to come under scrutiny. We need to ensure that at an organizational level, we ensure everybody is well educated. That's the start. You start with a top-down approach. Make sure that the people that are most vulnerable, as in the people who have to stand on a minbar every week, sometimes on a daily basis, in some masajid, teaching the Quran, teaching hadith, teaching seerah, are really informed on how this is going to affect it, because it's really going to have a drastic impact on our ability to teach and practice our religion the way we did before it was passed, without at the risk of sounding overly dramatic. And then you go down from there and make sure that young people who can be brash, who can be immature, and who can say silly things on social media are also educated. So the young Muslims, and particularly in Muslim schools and local schools, you start educating them on the dangers of saying certain things on social media.
And just to be sure, that's not to say that it's because what we're teaching or the way that it's being taught out is a problem. It's just that
The legislation.
everything can be, someone can be offended because
the bar is so terrifyingly low. As I said,
recited Alif
it's
Lam Mim.
not. Yeah, and it's not because there's anything whatsoever in our religion that's that we have to hide. You know, in fact, we have National Mosque Open Day every single year. We welcome people through our doors. We're happy to discuss any verse in the Quran because we look at every single word, letter, and verse with a great deal of pride, love, and passion. But we have to operate in the environment that we're forced to live in, and that environment right now is one that poses a significant risk to our imams, as I said, to young people who can sometimes say stupid things on social media. So I think the most important thing is, once this bill is passed, whatever form it's passed in, that we work at an organizational level to educate ourselves. And it's something that unfortunately we sometimes find ourselves behind the eight ball on. And that's upsetting, because in fact we actually need to be ahead of everyone else, because we're so often specifically targeted and affected more than any other community by these laws, the way they're passed, the way they're structured, the way they're designed. Like you talk about the National Socialist Network and far-right extremism and social cohesion and this bill. The bill only targets religious leaders. Most of the far right in Australia, it's unlike the USA and the UK. Most of it is non-religious secular people. So targeting religious leaders is very clearly something that's going to disproportionately affect and impact the Muslim community. And so for those reasons, we need to make sure that we're educated, that we're across these laws, that we inform people in those positions of power and who are particularly vulnerable of what they can and can't say, the impact on their speech, and we'll really start to get ahead of the curve on what our rights and responsibilities are.
Can I add one thing, Bill?
Yep.
One thing that
30 seconds, Haj.
yeah, very quickly. One thing that we can do, we don't have to wait to do that. We can do it right now. Politicians are elected. Write to your member. You know, you're always complaining about the organizations don't do this, the community leaders don't do this. We don't. This is your chance. You elected these people. These people are elected. All they believe in is a vote. If you write an email to your member of parliament saying, if these laws or legislations are passed, I will not be voting for you. It's very simple. That affects them because they live on a vote and they're going to be judged on whether they get into parliament the next elections or not. So it's very simple. Write to your member of parliament, demand that they halt this legislation and consult the Muslim community because we're bearing the brunt of these hate crimes.
Absolutely. Jazakumullah khair.
Alaikum inshallah. Jazakallah khair for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so
In
much.
the studio, Salim as well.
Yes, our guy behind the camera today. Usually it's myself, but today we've changed it up a little bit.
Everyone.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you both immensely. Jazakallah khair for sharing your knowledge with us and your experience with us, Haj. If you do have any questions, any thoughts, any anything that you'd like to share, please feel free to keep it in the chat. Leave it, leave it as a live discussion. Where we can, we might jump in and sort of offer some thoughts and whatnot. If anybody has any particular legal questions or anything like that, feel free to message us on the page, and we will try to answer those. Don't want to get Majed to do too much pro bono work, but my assumption is that he's going to be. Mashallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all the hard work that you do. Jazakallah khair for following us and for Jazakallah khair for viewing this episode, watching along with us and listening. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep things easy on the community. Hopefully this legislation ends up getting shut down. Ironically, it looks like it might be heading that way, and we will hope that it does. And yeah, Jazakallah khair and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.